Imagine for a second that your child is studying like a Navy SEAL, deep in icy cold water, surrounded by great white sharks while trying to disarm a bomb. Now that sounds absolutely ridiculous, but that's what Navy SEALs have to do. They have to be able to do tasks in extremely stressful situation. They have to learn to embrace chaos, and this is extremely valuable for all kids, neurotypical kids and ADHD kids. So here's the deal. We're gonna make studying harder than it needs to be so that when your child gets into an exam situation, it will be a walk in the park. That's why Navy SEALs go through Hell Week, where it's so darn hard to do anything they need to do, because once they get into a war zone, they've already experienced the chaos, and for them, it's almost a walk in the park. And I want the same thing to happen to your child, so that when they get into that exam situation, then they're already used to dealing with the chaos. If somebody plays with their crayons or pick their noses, or the clock is ticking, they won't be distracted by this because they will have the skills needed to learn to focus even through distractions. Make sense? Now, the techniques I want to share in this video can help any child study better and remember more. And get this, it even helped a memory champion shave not 1, not 2, not 5, not 10, but 13 seconds off the memory world record. So it works and it's amazing. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is a relatively tiny part of the brain. It's about 10% or so of the total size of the brain, but it packs a punch because it has more than 75% of the total amount of neurons in it. So it's extremely important. The cerebellum regulates basically balance. We're talking about physical balance, but also emotional balance and mental balance. And anything that has to do with balance in your life in general, actually. And you can see that if it regulates balance in general, it can be extremely useful for a child. So how can you train the cerebellum along with school subjects such as math, history, geography, so on and so forth? Well, it's actually quite simple. What you want to do is do balancing exercise and ask questions at the same time, or ask your child to do certain tasks related to their homework at the same time. So here's how it works. I'll give you an example, right? So they could have a blindfold on their eyes, you make them spin around, and then you ask them a question while they're dizzy and they need to answer it. So that's step 1. Step 2, once they get comfortable with that, you make them spin around again with the blindfold, you take it off, and you ask them to walk straight, touch a point on the wall while answering questions like multiplication tables, right? So that's one challenging balancing activities that it could do to strengthen their cerebellum along with school work. Another fantastic activity that I do with my kids almost every day is go on a balancing board. Now they can put their feet more far apart or together, and that will change the level of difficulty. And while on the balancing board, you can ask them once again questions related to geography, math, memory questions, so on and so forth. And to make it a little bit more difficult, 1 eye closed, 2 eye closed. To make it a little bit more difficult, then you say, okay, you need to stay 5 seconds without moving on the balancing board while answering the questions. Another great exercise that you can do with your child is to go up the stairs but backwards. Once again, asking those school questions, trying remembering different things while doing the task. Now that's going to strengthen the connection in the cerebellum. Now, one of the things that I should probably have mentioned before is that there's a really interesting thing that happens when people have accidents and their cerebellum gets damaged. You see, when a neurotypical person has an accident and their cerebellum gets damaged, they develop symptoms that are identical to ADHD. That means that strengthening the cerebellum, the connection inside the cerebellum, is extremely important. Not only for kids with ADHD, but also for neurotypical kids, because they will simply get better. All right? Now, all the cerebellum training in the world will not work if it's not mixed with dopamine. Now, dopamine is a neurotransmitter in your brain, and it's basically the captain of your brain. It regulates mood, attention, motivation, and it makes you feel good. Now, Navy SEALs know how important dopamine is. That is why that when they do Hell's Weeks, for instance, and they go through a 48 hours intensive no sleep training process, they will say, okay, the winning team will not get 10 minutes, but will get 20 minutes of sleep during that 48 hours period. Now, they fight like crazy to get that 20 minutes because it is so important for them to get that sleep. It seems like a tiny reward, but it is really, really motivating. So what we want to do is integrate tiny rewards through our cerebellum training, through our balancing training. And here's how it works. So let's say you ask your child to go on the balancing board. They go on the balancing board and you ask them math questions, right? Multiplication tables. So what they would do, they would go on the balancing board and you would start asking them questions. For every 2 or 3 answers, you give them a reward, like a chip. When I mean one chip, I mean one chip. It is not a handful of chip. It is not 5, 6 chip. It is one chip. Once again, very important to make it a tiny reward. It could be a piece of chocolate. It could be a sip of their favorite drink. It could be a high five. It doesn't need to be food. It just needs to be a tiny reward that happens consistently every single time they have 2 to 3 correct answers. Now, once they're able to do this consistently, what you do is you start increasing the difficulty. So instead of giving a chip or a high five every 2 or 3 answers, you make it every 3 to 5 answers. So on and so forth, making it more and more challenging every single time, right? You don't want to make it too challenging because you don't want them to give up, but you don't want to make it too easy. So you have to be able to judge the situation. Sometimes you want to make it a bit more easy for them to encourage them. Sometimes you want to make it a little bit more hard to also encourage them. Once they're able to do this, to stretch beyond 2 or 3 answers, then what you want to do is integrate more cerebellum into the mix. So you ask them, once again, if they're on the balancing board, to go on the balancing board and to stay stable for 5 seconds while answering 2 questions or 3 questions or so on and so forth. Now, staying stable is extremely, extremely difficult. So if they can do it, they get 1 chip. They get 1 chip. They get 1 chip, so on and so forth. Now, why is this super important, especially for kids with ADHD? It's because kids with ADHD have difficulty with what's called dopamine uptake. That means they have difficulty keeping the dopamine in their body and generating dopamine. So it's extremely important for them to have small, consistent rewards immediately after doing a good action. You see, kids with ADHD have difficulty seeing long-term rewards. So while it is okay and highly suggested to give them a long-term reward, so let's say if they do all of their homework properly this week, we can go see a movie this weekend, right? Or if they get a certain grade on their test, we can go see a movie or do an activity on the weekend. Or if they do all the cerebellum training during the week, they can have something on the weekend, right? While it is totally okay and great to do that, what's important is to have those tiny rewards throughout the week, every time that they're studying, right? But I strongly encourage to have a bigger reward at the end of the week too. And that's going to do is that it's going to compound the reward, which is extremely powerful also. It works fantastic for ADHD kids and it works fantastically well also for neurotypical kids. However, and I want to leave you with this, what I would not do is reward with video games. Now, video games are not great, especially for kids with ADHD. Now, we'll talk more about this in the second part of this video. So if you're interested, please go ahead, hit that subscribe button and the bell so that you can be notified when I post in the next video. Cheers and bye for now.